Baptist Church Able Wednesday night Bible study. We're sure glad to have you tonight. Seems like it's been forever since we've been up here, but it really hasn't been that long. If we can all stand, we'll try to praise Him with some song. Did y'all get thinking this to yourself through the last couple of weeks? I'm weak, but Thou art strong. I am weak, but Thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk. Let me walk close to Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but Thee, dear Lord, none but Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. When my feeble life is old, time for me will be no more. Guide me gently, safely home to Thy kingdom shore, to Thy shore. Just a closer walk with Thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Amen. We all sounded pretty good on that one. Somebody must have got some rest for the last few days. I'm not real sure who, but I could point fingers, but anymore, exercise to me is trying to stand up. There's coming a day where I don't have to worry about it anymore. None of us do. There is coming a day when no heartache shall come, no more clouds in the sky, no more tears to dim the eye. All is peace forevermore on this happy golden shore. What a day, glorious day, a day that will be when my Jesus I shall see. When I look upon his face, the one who saved me by his grace. When he takes me by the hand and leads me through the promised land. What a day, glorious day that will be. What a day that will be when my Jesus I shall see. When I look upon his face, the one who saved me by his grace. When he takes me by the hand and leads me through the promised land. What a day, glorious day that will be. What a day, glorious day that will be. Thank you. You can be seated.
All right, thank you, Ann. Turn in your Bibles with me. It's a good night, by the way. Esther chapter 7 and 8. We find the great conclusion of the story. We actually have one more study. That's next Wednesday night of 9 and 10, although 10 is extremely short, and we'll look at that next week. But really, the big conclusion we see tonight, and again, more good content next week, but tonight is the conclusion that we've been waiting for, Esther chapter 7 and 8. When Ann shared a while ago that the comment was, standing up is exercise to her. Well, we were all standing at the time. When I came here in 1998, we did not ever stand the whole time for the music service because we're Baptist, and the way that Baptists did it then, we did 5 hymns, and you stand up for the first one, and then you get to sit down for a while, and then you stand up they have you stand up for the last one, and that's just how we did it. And over the years, as other churches were moving to just standing up the whole time, I wasn't having any of that. You got to sit down at least half the time. And the reason is because I stand up for the music service and then I stand up for the sermon. I'm the only one that stands up the entire service. And then we have 2 services, so on Sundays I stand up for 2 hours straight, not complaining, but you don't get any sympathy from me because you have to stand for a few songs anyway. But I said, so we got this guy named Matt, and Matt made, the first Sunday he was here, he made everybody stand up the whole time. And so in staff meeting that next day, I said, Matt, buddy, you can't do that. We're Baptists. We don't stand up the whole time. You got to let us sit down and rest some. He said, no, you stand up for worship. And he was very adamant about it. So from then on, we stood up. Now, we've had other music leaders since then, and you're still standing, bless your heart. But it's funny what she said a while ago, Ann, when she said, I stand up for exercise. If you stand up for 2 hours, it does feel like exercise. But by the grace of God, I'm able to do that. And every preacher everywhere now, most Baptist preachers stand up the whole time as our tradition has changed. Esther chapter 7. By the way, my commentary tonight is primarily the Bible exposition commentary by Warren Wiersbe. And chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king again asked Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. Now, let me stop right there. Look at me just for a minute. Just to catch you up, if you weren't here the last few times, this is a story about a Jewish woman named Esther. Her stepdad, we'll call him her stepdad, his name was Mordecai, another faithful Jew. And they lived in the Persian kingdom, and the king at the time was a king named Xerxes. Your translation may use another name. He had 2 or 3 names. Artaxerxes. Okay, mine just calls him Xerxes. So anyway, so I'm just go with Xerxes because again, that's easy to remember. And so he's, again, as I shared from day one, what I call a hedonistic narcissist. His wife made him mad one night, or he got mad at his wife. He was sloppy drunk and told her to do something. She didn't want to do it. And so he got rid of her and got a new wife. Had a big contest all over the kingdom, prettiest woman. And Esther won the contest, basically, and she became his queen. He does not know she's a Jew because her stepdad Mordecai told her to keep that a secret, and that comes into play in this very scene. In fact, it's the most critical secret there is, because this scene would not have taken place had the bad guy, Haman, known that she was a Jew. And so Haman, who is the right-hand guy of the king gave him his signet ring, which means that he could make pronouncements on behalf of the king, and it carried the weight of the king. And he came in one day and said, because he went in and out of the palace area, everybody bowed. They were required by law to bow to him. And one guy wouldn't bow, Mordecai, the Jew. And Haman was so mad at Mordecai that he decided not only to execute Mordecai, but execute all the Jews. So he came in with this big story to the king. There's this group of people throughout the kingdom, and they're causing trouble. Never told him they were Jews. And he said, I'll even pay for it. I don't want them threatening your rule. And king said, oh yeah, good idea. Go ahead, kill them all. And so he put up posters everywhere in every language. Hey, at the end of the year, you're all going to die. And so this got back to Mordecai, who saw the poster, took down a poster, showed it to Queen Esther. And so there's the problem. They're all going to die at the end of the year. The king, who's not a particularly bright guy, does not know his wife is Jewish. And you think it would come up in a conversation at some point, but it hasn't. And so he does not know. And again, important for tonight, he does not know that he has passed an edict around the entire kingdom that all Jews are supposed to die, and his wife is a Jew, and so he's unwittingly signed his wife's death warrant. And so she comes to him. Mordecai says, you got to do something. She says, okay, eventually. And she goes to the king and pleads, makes a request to him. He said, what's your request? She said, well, if you'll come, I've got a banquet prepared for you and for your number one guy, Haman. If you'll come to the banquet, I will tell you there. So they came to the banquet, and he said, okay, what's your request? Up to half my kingdom. And she says, well, come back tomorrow. I'll do another banquet for the both of you, and then I will tell you. And so this is banquet number 2 now that we see in verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and as they were drinking wine on that second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I've found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. Now, whatever the king is expecting to hear from her, a new horse, some fine jewelry, some more servants, some new dresses maybe. He's not expecting her to plead for her own life. This is a blind side from him. Not expecting this. Grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. So ever since the previous evening's banquet, Xerxes had been waiting to hear the queen's petition. So when the wine was served, he broached the subject. Of course, the statement, even to half of the kingdom, was likely a royal promise that wasn't to be taken literally. And by the way, we see this again in the New Testament. It's in Daniel. It's also in Mark, remember? It was how John the Baptist lost his head with the very same statement from the king. It simply meant the king would be generous. And therefore, tell him what you want. He's probably going to grant it if it's reasonable. So during the previous 24 hours, Esther had probably rehearsed this speech many times, and now God gave her the strength to deliver it. Remember, she was taking her life into her own hands for the king. If the king rejected her plea, that would be the end. Also remember that Haman, the number one guy of the king who is there, the only two people there, the king and Haman, who, because he hated Mordecai, has decided to have Mordecai executed, and he put up gallows for Mordecai, a 75-foot tall structure, so that everybody in the kingdom could see him hanging up there. And again, Persians didn't typically hang by ropes like we do, by the neck. They had them impaled, and so they were hanging that way, which was even worse, of course. And that was the execution that Haman had planned for Mordecai, until that all went wrong, because the king remembered that Mordecai saved his life by reporting to traitors, and so he had Mordecai rewarded, and he made Haman do the rewarding. And so that was humiliating for Haman, of course. And so after suffering that previous humiliation, he now goes to this banquet. Again, not realizing what is about to happen. So his week just went from bad to worse really quick. She made it clear from the beginning that she depended on the favor of the king and was not trying to tell him what to do. She also said that her desire wasn't to please herself, but was to please the king. If it pleases the king, she said. This was good psychology, especially when dealing with a chauvinistic monarch like Xerxes. It was also wise on her part not to say, "There's a man in your kingdom who plans to destroy all the Jews." She focused her petition on the fact that the queen's life was in danger and the king had to do something about it. We have no reason to believe that we have reason to believe, every reason to believe that Xerxes loved his queen and did not want any harm to come to her. As he sat there in her presence and beheld her beauty, her words moved him. What monster would want to kill the queen? Again, he's blindsided. Not only was the queen's life in danger, but her people were also in danger of being slain. It's likely that this statement perplexed the king. Who were her people? Wasn't she a Persian? Has she been keeping a secret? It's got to be a surprising moment for him. In fact, he dismisses himself, we'll see, to go think about it a while, something he rarely did. And so it was then that Esther reminded the king that the decree he had approved to wipe out the Jewish nation. In fact, her words are almost verbatim from the decree that we see in chapter 3. Xerxes was smart enough to put two and two together and understand that Queen Esther was a Jewess, and he had unwittingly consented to her murder. And who did that? Who caused him to unwittingly do that? The guy sitting right by him. Verse 5, King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is this vile Haman." Again, you can't even make a movie this good. The shock in Haman's eyes, because we can't see it. We can read about it, but we can't see it. It's got to be the most startling moment in his life. The enemy is Haman right there. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Because again, apparently Haman did not know she was Jewish. He was clueless. Obviously, if he knew she was Jewish and she was the stepdaughter of Mordecai, he wouldn't be building a gallows for Mordecai. He has no idea he's having a party from the stepdaughter of the very guy he wants to execute. So he's really clueless. King's clueless. Haman's even more clueless. And so he's getting a clue now really quickly. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Verse 7, the king got up in a rage, left his wine, but that's a big deal. Apparently, he doesn't leave his wine often. Left his wine and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, and what's his fate? Yeah, that's the end of him. Already realized realizing he'd already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. It just gets better and better. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she's with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Yeah, when you get the bag over the head, it's over. It's not going to go well. So at this point, try to imagine what was going through the mind of King Xerxes. Without openly accusing him, Esther has implicated the king in a horrible crime. And he was bound to feel guilty. The king knew that he had impetuously approved the decree without even asking what nation it was. But he didn't realize that the decree was part of a conspiracy. He had signed the death warrant for his own wife. The king had to find a way to save his wife and save face at the same time. He needed a bad guy. Fortunately, there happened to be one in the room. In an absolute monarchy, the king is looked up upon as almost a god, in often cases as a god, and can do no wrong. This is why ancient monarchs always had a stable of scapegoats available, people who could take the blame for the ignorance or inefficiency of the throne. By the way, modern politicians do the same thing. Therefore, the king's question in verse 5 implied much more than who's guilty. The king was also looking for someone to punish. And I think Haman probably noticed that, figured that out really quickly. 2 and 2 is not hard to add up at this point. and he had it coming, by the way. Haman had it coming. Xerxes had already received one surprise when he learned the nationality of his queen, and now he would be hit with another. His favorite officer was the adversary and enemy who had plotted the whole thing and deceived the king. Esther didn't reveal that Haman, like the king, had just learned from her own lips that she was Jewish. Perhaps Xerxes concluded that Haman's crime was wanting to slay the queen, and he had decided to accomplish it by killing all the Jews. At this point, the king doesn't even know. He doesn't even realize that Haman's just as surprised as he is. Regardless, the king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. We've already noted that Xerxes was a man with a short temper. We know that. Got rid of his first wife just because he got mad when he was drunk. But on this occasion, his anger must have been volcanic. His masculine pride was hurt because he had misjudged the character of Haman. He had made a fool of himself by promoting Haman and by giving him so much influence. And again, at this moment, Haman is wearing the king's own signet ring. Not for long, by the way. So the king had made a fool of himself by promoting Haman and by giving him so much influence. The king had also erred in approving the decree without first weighing all the facts. As a result, he had endangered the lives of 2 very special Jews in his life, Mordecai, who saved his life, and Esther, his beloved wife. No doubt the king walked to and fro in the garden, doing his best to control the anger that welled up in him. Proverbs 19:12 says, "The king's wrath is as the roaring of a lion." No wonder Haman was afraid. He had been near enough to the king to recognize and interpret his every mood. He knew the king was about to become judge and jury and pass a sentence from which there was no escape. In the Jewish commentary on Esther, Dr. S. Goldman, again a Jewish scholar, makes this telling statement about verse 8. He says this: "The arrogant bully became, as usually in the face of disaster, a whining coward. When the authority of the king had been behind him, Haman could courageously strut around, demand respect, and give orders. But now that the anger of the king was against him, Haman's true character was revealed. He was not a giant. He was only a tiny man full of pride and hot air." What a paradox. Haman had been furious because a Jewish man wouldn't bow down to him. And now Haman was kneeling and bowing before a Jewish woman begging for his own life. You see the irony there? When the king entered the room and saw the scene, he accused Haman of trying to molest the queen. In his anger, the king would have exaggerated anything Haman did, and besides that, molesting the queen was a capital crime, of course. Forget about the conspiracy. Everybody could see for themselves that Haman was guilty of attacking the queen. For that crime alone, he deserved to die. If you remember from chapter 6, after escorting Mordecai around the city, Haman had covered his head in humiliation. But now the king's guard covered Haman's head in preparation for his execution. Twice in 2 days, his head was covered. You got to find that ironic. Verse 9, Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it made for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." So his attendants all know. The king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's anger subsided. Proverbs 11:8 says, "The righteous man is rescued from trouble, and it comes on the wicked instead." The conspicuous gallows that were obvious to everybody, that's why it was built, that Haman had constructed for Mordecai was convenient for the execution of Haman. Therefore, because they're right by his house, after all, therefore the king used it. Apparently, Haman had let it be known in the palace that he planned to kill Mordecai because the king's servants knew the purpose of the gallows. In his pride, Haman had boasted too much, and his words came back not only to haunt him, but to help slay him. The day before, Haman had led Mordecai through the streets dressed in royal splendor, but now Haman was led through the streets with a covering over his face and a gallows at the end of his journey. Galatians 6:7 says, "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." Haman sowed anger against Mordecai, and he reaped anger from the king. Haman wanted to kill Mordecai and the Jews, and the king killed Haman. This unchanging principle of sowing and reaping is illustrated throughout the Bible and applies both to believers and unbelievers. Jacob killed an animal and lied to his father. Do you remember that? Pretending to be Esau, he had that fleece on his back. And years later, Jacob's sons killed an animal and lied to him, pretending that Joseph was dead. Pharaoh gave orders to drown the Jewish baby boys, and one day his army was drowned in the Red Sea. David secretly took his neighbor's wife and committed adultery, and David's own son Absalom took his father's concubines and openly committed adultery with them. David killed Bathsheba's husband, and 3 of David's own sons were slain: Absalom, Amnon, and Adonijah. Saul of Tarsus encouraged the stoning of Stephen in Acts chapter 8. And when he became Paul, the missionary, he himself was stoned at Lystra. Amazingly and rarely, he survived that stoning. But he was stoned. Don't you see the irony there, or the interesting fact of you reap what you sow? He was encouraging the stoning of the first Christian martyr, and then not realizing that one day he himself would be stoned for his faith in Christ. But let's keep in mind that this law of sowing and reaping also applies to doing what is good and right. If we sow to the flesh, we reap corruption. But if we sow to the Spirit, we reap life everlasting. That's Galatians chapter 6, verse 8. No good deed done for the glory of Jesus Christ will ever be forgotten before God. No loving word spoken in Jesus' name will ever be wasted. If we don't see the harvest in this life, we'll see it when we stand before our God in heaven. So that's chapter 7. Any comments or additions to anything in chapter 7, or any questions?
Did they
Well, they went to 2 separate banquets, and of course they drank at both. I doubt the king ever had a meal without drinking. Of course, Jesus drank on a regular basis because they didn't have Texas iced tea. They didn't have sweet tea. I feel bad for them. And so, and I'm not a historian with cleanliness, but water was not always safe to drink back then. They didn't have the filtration systems that we have today, but wine was safe to drink, and so they typically drank wine as much as water with their meals.
That's why Paul told Timothy to drink some wine for his stomach.
Have a little wine for his stomach, yes. And they would use it for medicinal purposes as well. Yes, in fact, being sick, if he drank water, it could have made things a lot worse if the water wasn't clean.
I was thinking they was partying for 2 days and then out.
Oh, right. No, it was a separate banquet. By the way, we do have filtration systems now, and we have iced tea. So don't go out saying the pastor says, it's the only clean liquid available. Okay, all right. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
I only went to one Purim celebration in a Jewish synagogue, and they do this whole thing, and they read the whole story of Esther, and every time you hear Mordecai's name, you
Oh, yeah.
noisemakers, and every time Haman's name is mentioned, you boo and you catcall, and
Oh.
it goes through the whole series, and every time these names are mentioned, you fortify the person in that story.
Yeah, and whether you realize it or not, that is the standard in Hollywood in movies. If you remember Star Wars in 1977, every time Darth Vader entered into the scene, there was where's Darth Vader music, dun 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 dun, and every time, every scene, they play that music. In Superman, every time he turns into Superman and puts on his super suit and flies off, they play music for that, a particular song just for Superman. And so that thematic thing, and this plays out just like a great movie. It really does. And I can understand why they would do that. I wonder what music he would play as he was being drug off to be hung. So, yeah, dum-da-dum-dum. All right, Esther chapter 8, verse 1. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. It just gets better and better. And by the way, again, this didn't happen a month or 2 months or 6 months later. That same day, this happened. And so, according to the ancient historians, whenever a traitor was executed, the throne appropriated his property. That is, the king automatically inherited all that Haman had. And because he was number 2 in the kingdom, he probably had a huge estate. Had Xerxes confiscated Haman's property for himself, he would have acquired a great deal of wealth. But he chose to give Haman's estate to Esther. More than an act of generosity, this gift was probably the king's way of atoning for his own foolish decisions that had brought so much pain on Esther and her people. God doesn't always give us this kind of a happy ending to everybody's story. Today, not all faithful Christians are promoted and given special honors. Some die for their faith. Some of them get fired because of their stand for Christ. God hasn't promised that we'll be promoted and made rich, but he has assured us that he's in control of all circumstances and that he alone will write the last chapter of our lives. If God doesn't promote us here on earth, he will certainly do so when we enter heaven. You reap what you sow. Jesus spoke all the time. It was a huge theme in his teaching that we should store up for ourselves treasure in heaven. Now, we can't earn heaven. That's through the blood of Christ. But Jesus himself said, even though we get to heaven on grace, nothing that we can say or do will merit that. But once we're in heaven, some will have more treasure than others. You reap what you sow. Now, I can't tell you what that treasure is in its entirety. I'm most curious, and people debate that quite often and discuss that to quite great length. But I know it will be wonderful in heaven. Verse 3. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. So this is after the death of Haman. He's now dead. It's all gone. And they moved on, and she goes to the king, though, to formally and specifically ask for the deliverance of her people. Verse 5, if it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he's pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster follow my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? Esther couldn't do everything, but she could do something. And what she could do, she did. She approached the throne of the king and asked him to reverse the edict that Haman had devised. It was her interceding at the throne that saved the people of Israel from slaughter. She was asking nothing for herself except that the king save her people and deliver her from the heavy burden of her heart. As we've studied scriptures, you might be impressed with how many people have prayed for the Jews. When Israel sinned, Moses met God on the mountain and interceded for them in Exodus 32. He was even willing for God to blot him out of the book of life if that's what it took to rescue the nation. He did that on Israel's behalf. Centuries later, the Apostle Paul said he was willing to be, quote, accursed from Christ if it would help save unbelieving Israel. That's Romans chapter 9, verse 1. On Mount Carmel, Elijah prayed for the disobedient Israel, and in the palace, Nehemiah prayed for the Jews in Jerusalem. Like Nehemiah, Ezra wept and prayed and asked God to help his sinful people in Ezra chapter 9, and Daniel humbled himself and fasted and prayed that he might understand what God's plan was for Israel in Daniel 9. So yeah, many people interceding on behalf of the Israelites in the Bible, just like Queen Esther did. Verse 7, King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have hanged him in the gallows. Now write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you. And seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. We'll get to that in a minute. At once the royal secretaries were summoned. On the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan, they wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, nobles of the 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province, in the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves. That sounds a lot like our Constitution. The right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of the king Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the day of Adar. Remember, that's when they were all supposed to die. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, verse 14, riding the royal horses, raced out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was also issued in the citadel of Susa. Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. Now this guy's wearing blue and white with a purple robe and a gold crown. Looks like a king. It's not the king, but it's as close to King Xerxes as you could get without being the king. And the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. Verse 16, for the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province, in every city, wherever the edict of the king went, there was joy and gladness among the Jews with feasting and celebration. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. This reminds me of the last scene in Star Wars, where they had faced annihilation, and now those who were so brave were being honored up in front of everybody and getting giant medals. It's that kind of scene. The problem Esther and Mordecai faced was that the king, simply by executive fiat, couldn't cancel the first edict, since the laws of the Medes and Persians were unalterable. In modern democratic nations, legislators can reverse decisions and revoke laws, and the Supreme Court of the land can even declare laws unconstitutional, but not so in the ancient Persian Empire. The voice of the king was the law of the land, and the king could do no wrong. So how do you undo that? The king couldn't legally revoke his edict, but he could issue a new decree that would favor the Jews. So the new decree would let everybody in the empire know that the king wanted his people to have a different attitude toward the Jews and look favorably upon them. The citizens didn't have to hire a lawyer to explain the new edict to them. You can be sure they got the message. Don't attack the Jews on that particular day or any day. Since Mordecai was now prime minister, it was his job to draft the new decree. What he did was give the Jews permission to defend themselves against anybody who tried to kill them and take their property. There were many people in the entire empire, like Haman, who hated the Jews, wanted to destroy them, and get their hands on their wealth. The new decree allowed the Jews to assemble and defend themselves, but they were not allowed to be the aggressors. You know, I say the irony in all of this is we still have not moved beyond this. Only today, the president of Harvard University resigned under pressure because of anti-Semitic behavior. Isn't that interesting? In the 21st century, people haven't changed much. By the way, scholars don't agree on the translation of verse 11. If any of you have King James, you may have noticed a different translation of that. The KJV, or King James, gives the impression that the edict allowed the Jews to destroy the wives and children of their attackers and plunder their spoil. And the other translations, like the NASB, New American Standard, seem to agree with this interpretation. However, other translations, like the NIV, connects women and children with the Jews being attacked and does not suggest that the Jews killed the women and children of their attackers. So obviously I would prefer the NIV. It goes to say that Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, is not always easy to translate. I know you probably remember this. I've told you before. In all handwritten, if you've ever seen a handwritten manuscript or a copy of the Old Testament, for example, if you've ever been to the Dome of the Rock, not the Dome of the Rock, they don't call it the Dome of the Rock, the Dome of the Book at the museum in Jerusalem, the Museum of Israel in Jerusalem, there is scrolled out for you an exact duplicate copy of the Isaiah scroll, and you can see it in that scroll as well as any of the writings of the Old Testament that are in Hebrew, but it was the same in Greek as well. Because these scrolls, the parchment they were written on, was very expensive. And so they did not bother to put in anything, that they crammed it all in there. And so there were no capital letters, there were no sentence beginnings or endings, there was no punctuation, there were no periods. So everything that we use to denote one word from another and one sentence from another is gone. Now, if I were to say an English paragraph, remove all the punctuation, because you and I grew up with English, we could sit down in a few minutes, figure out which words go with what, and which sentence, and et cetera, et cetera. Does that make sense? We can figure out, we know it's our native language. But if somebody came in from another country and tried to look at that English paragraph, they would have a great deal of difficulty trying to figure out which letter goes with which word in certain words, and it's the same with Hebrew. And so trying to determine exactly what word goes with what, or what clause goes with what word modifies what, is not always easy to do in any ancient manuscript, not just the Bible, but any and every ancient manuscript. So there are different interpretations of that. So I'm not saying that either one is right or wrong, I'm just saying it's a different interpretation. The statement that many of the people in the land became Jews, that's verse 17, is also variously interpreted. The obvious meaning is that many Gentiles in the empire forsook their pagan religions and became Jewish proselytes. But since the Jews were far from Jerusalem in the ministry of the priests, these converts could not be initiated fully into the Jewish faith. They became what were later known as God-fearers, or worshipers of God, just like the Ethiopian eunuch that Philip encountered on the desert road. Sitting there reading from a scroll, he was a God-fearer. Perhaps the phrase means that many of the Gentiles in the empire sided with the Jews and acted as though they were Jews. They weren't ashamed to be identified with the Jews, even though the Jews had many enemies. After President Ronald Reagan was shot, if you were alive then, most of you in this room were, maybe watching online, you don't know, or people in the booth don't remember, no, they're shaking their head. Ronald Reagan was an actor who became a president, and somebody shot him, okay? When he was being prepared for surgery, he jokingly said, and Ronald Reagan had a great sense of humor, by the way, one of the best for the presidents. So when he was being prepped for surgery, he jokingly said to the medical team, "I hope all of you are Republicans." One of the doctors replied, "Mr. President, today all of us are Republicans." That was the attitude of many of the people in the Persian Empire. When Mordecai's edict was published, today all of us are Jews, because he made it popular to be Jewish. The book of Esther opens with the Jews keeping a very low profile, so much so that Esther and Mordecai would not even confess their nationality. But now the Jews are proud of their race and so happy with what God has done that they were attracting others to their faith. Even the pagan Gentiles could see that God was caring for his people in a remarkable way. All right, and that's chapter 7 and chapter 8. Any comments about either chapter? Okay, it's not over. We got one more week to study and finish the book of Esther. All right, with that, we do not have a prayer sheet tonight, I don't believe. Turns out Wendy, bless her heart, who sang on the stage Sunday morning faithfully, Monday morning tested positive for COVID. So I hope you didn't hug her and spend a lot of time with her Sunday.